You can see these jet tube outlets. These are one by one started at 6 a.m. all the way up to 9 a.m. Then they'll have a full bypass, and that's going to be at 39,000 cubic feet per second. So that's one heck of a release, especially it's going to be for 72 hours.
It happened on a Tuesday morning in March. Engineers stood over a control panel and did something that had never been done in history. They pushed a button that released a flood so massive it shook the bedrock of the Grand Canyon. For decades, this region had been starving, dried out by human intervention. But when those tubes opened, something rose from the depths that shocked everyone. It wasn't just water, it was a force that turned back the clock. But here is the catch. What rose from beneath the surface threatened to change the map of America forever. Breaking the flow. The morning of March 26, 1996 started like any other in the Arizona desert. The air was dry, the sun was beating down on the red rocks, and the Colorado River was drifting along at its usual controlled pace. But inside the control room of the Glen Canyon Dam, the atmosphere was thick with tension. You see, a group of engineers and scientists were about to do something that sounded borderline insane. They were going to simulate a natural disaster. For decades, the dam had held the river back, turning a wild, roaring beast into a tame trickle. But on this day, they were going to let the beast out of the cage. At exactly 6:20 in the morning, the order was given. Slowly, the massive steel gates of the jet tubes began to creak open. These weren't the normal turbines that generate electricity. These were the bypass tubes, giant metal throats designed to vomit water straight from the reservoir into the riverbed below. The sound was deafening. Imagine standing next to a jet engine during takeoff. Now multiply that by 10. Water exploded out of the dam at a speed and pressure that is hard to even comprehend. Within minutes, the flow jumped from a polite stream to a raging torrent. We are talking about nearly 335,000 gallons of water shooting through the canyon every single second. To put that into perspective, that is enough water to fill the Empire State Building in less than 20 minutes. It is enough to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool in the time it takes you to blink. Downstream, the river transformed instantly. The water level surged, rising 16 feet higher than normal. It wasn't just water, though, it was a liquid bulldozer. The force of the flood ripped up tons of sand, silt, and rocks from the river bottom, debris that hadn't moved since the 60s. The ground shook, literally. The vibrations from the water crashing into the riverbed could be felt through the soles of your boots if you were standing on the canyon rim. But here is the catch. This wasn't just about making a splash. This was a desperate attempt to turn back time. For millions of years, the Colorado River had flooded naturally every spring. Snow from the Rocky Mountains would melt, sending a massive pulse of water and mud down through the Grand Canyon. This yearly violence was actually what kept the canyon alive. It built beaches, it carved channels, and it fed the ecosystem. But when we built the dam, we stopped the heartbeat. The river went into cardiac arrest. So, in 1996, we tried to use a defibrillator. The goal was to see if we could trick nature into thinking the dam wasn't there. Scientists lined the banks, cameras rolling, sensors in the water, watching to see what would happen when the Red River returned. The crazy part is that for a few days, it worked. The water churned up the bottom, turning a deep chocolate brown. It began to deposit massive sandbars along the banks, rebuilding beaches that had vanished years ago. It looked like a miracle. But as the floodwaters raged on for a week, pushing 238 billion gallons downstream, the engineers began to realize something. They had unleashed a force they could start, but they couldn't fully control. The water was doing exactly what they asked, but the river had changed too much in 30 years. The channel was different, the plants were different, the very shape of the canyon had shifted, and getting this right was a matter of life and death for the ecosystem. The flood of '96 was a spectacle, a display of raw human power over nature. But as the water eventually receded and the roar faded back to a hum, the silence that followed was heavy. The sand was back, yes, but for how long? And what exactly had we disturbed by churning up millions of tons of sediment that had been sleeping in the dark? The experiment was over, but the real story was just beginning. The river had tasted freedom again, and as we would soon find out, it wasn't going to go back to being a prisoner quietly. This massive release of water was just the beginning of a battle that would reveal a terrifying secret hidden in the mud. The invisible crisis. To understand why they had to flood the canyon, you have to understand what the dam actually did to the river. And it is not what you think. Most people look at the clear blue-green water of the Colorado River below the dam and think, wow, that looks pristine. It looks like a postcard. But to a biologist, that crystal clear water looks like death. You see, the Colorado River was never meant to be blue. The name Colorado literally means colored red in Spanish. For millions of years, this river was a warm, muddy, gritty soup of sediment. It carried mountains of sand and silt all the way from the Rockies to the ocean. This mud wasn't just dirt, it was the lifeblood of the canyon. It built the beaches where animals rested. It created the backwaters where fish spawned. It protected the archaeological sites from wind and rain. But here's the deal. When they built the Glen Canyon Dam in 1963, they put a giant filter on the river. The dam acts like a trap. The water stops behind the concrete wall in Lake Powell. The sand and silt settle to the bottom of the reservoir. And what comes out the other side? Clear, cold, sediment-free water. Scientists call this hungry water. Because the water has no sand in it, it wants to pick some up. So, as it shoots out of the dam, it scours the riverbed, ripping away the sand that is already there but not replacing it with anything new. It is like a vacuum cleaner that never empties its bag. Over 30 years, this hungry water ate the Grand Canyon alive. The beautiful sandy beaches that early explorers camped on? Gone, replaced by sharp, jagged rocks. The native fish that needed warm, muddy water to hide from predators? They started to vanish, hunted to extinction in the clear water by trout that thrive in the cold. Basically, we terraformed the Grand Canyon without even meaning to. We turned a warm, muddy, dynamic river into a cold, clear, static canal. And then came the invasion. Since the flood stopped, the natural rhythm of the river died. In the old days, the spring floods would rip out any plants trying to grow too close to the water's edge. It kept the channel open. But with the dam controlling the flow, the water level stayed nice and steady. This was a VIP invitation for invasive species. Plants like tamarisk and camelthorn moved in. These aren't just bushes, they are aggressive conquerors. They formed a dense, impenetrable green wall along the banks. They sucked up the water, locked down the remaining sand, and choked out the native plants. So by the 90s, the Grand Canyon was in crisis. It looked beautiful from the rim, but down at the bottom, the ecosystem was collapsing. The sandbars had shrunk by more than 90%. This is why the 1996 flood was so critical. It wasn't just an experiment, it was a rescue mission. But it is not that simple, though. The engineers thought that if they just added water, the river would fix itself. They thought the force of the water would scour out the invasive plants and churn up enough sand from the river bottom to rebuild the beaches. And initially, during the flood, it seemed to work. New beaches appeared overnight. The scientists were high-fiving. They thought they had cracked the code. But then the water level dropped back to normal, and the hungry water returned. Within months, the new sandbars began to erode. The hungry water ate them up and carried the sand downstream, eventually dumping it into Lake Mead, where it was useless. The realization hit the scientists hard. The river didn't just need water, it needed sand. And the dam was blocking 95% of the sand supply. The only sand available was what came in from small tributaries below the dam, like the Perry River. It was a supply and demand problem. We were demanding huge beaches, but the supply chain was broken. This led to a massive shift in strategy. They realized they couldn't just flood the river whenever they felt like it. They had to wait. They had to wait for the tributaries to flood, bringing fresh sand into the system, and then hit the button on the dam to push that sand up onto the banks. It became a game of timing, a high-stakes poker game with nature. But while the scientists were worrying about sand and fish, another group of people was watching the dam with fear. Because they remembered 1983. They remembered the year the water almost won. Everyone keeps talking about the lack of water, but few remember the terror of having too much. The river was starving for sand, but decades earlier it had tried to eat the dam itself in a catastrophe that was almost kept secret. The shaking dam. Let's rewind for a second. We keep talking about controlled floods where we open the gates on purpose. But there was one time when nature forced our hand and it almost ended in the destruction of the Glen Canyon Dam. The year was 1983. It was an El Niño year. The winter had been brutal, piling up record amounts of snow in the Rocky Mountains. Then in late spring, the weather suddenly turned hot. The snow melted all at once. A wall of water came rushing down the Colorado Basin into Lake Powell. The reservoir began to rise, and rise, and rise. The engineers were panicked. The water was coming in faster than they could let it out. The turbines were running at full capacity, screaming to push water through, but it wasn't enough. The lake was rising inches by the hour. If the water poured over the top of the dam, it could erode the foundation and cause a total collapse. So they had no choice. They had to open the spillways. These are massive tunnels drilled through the solid sandstone rock around the dam. They are the emergency exits for the water. They were designed to handle 200,000 gallons per second. On June 15th, the engineers opened the gates. At first, everything seemed fine. A jet of water shot out into the river below, but then the ground started to shake. Not a rumble, but a violent, terrifying vibration that could be felt in the employee lunchroom inside the dam. And then the water turned red. It wasn't a biological red, it was the color of pulverized Navajo sandstone. Inside the spillway tunnels, something catastrophic was happening. It is a physics phenomenon called cavitation. Basically, when water moves that fast over a surface, it creates tiny vacuum bubbles. When those bubbles collapse, they create shock waves that are strong enough to punch through solid steel and concrete. The water wasn't just flowing through the tunnel, it was eating it. The cavitation was ripping huge chunks of concrete out of the tunnel lining. It chewed through the steel rebar. It ate into the sandstone bedrock itself. The engineers watched in horror as chunks of bedrock the size of automobiles were spewed out into the river below. The water turned a thick, bloody red because it was literally dissolving the mountain the dam was built on. This was a nightmare scenario. If the erosion continued, the water could undermine the dam's abutments. The whole structure could fail. And get this, the water in the reservoir was still rising. They were caught in a deadly trap. If they closed the spillways, the water would overtop the dam and destroy it. If they kept the spillways open, the tunnel would collapse and destroy the dam. In a desperate, last-ditch effort, workers rushed to the top of the dam. They did something that sounds ridiculous for a billion-dollar piece of infrastructure. They bought sheets of plywood from the local hardware store. They built a makeshift fence, plywood extensions, along the top of the spillway gates to hold back just a few more feet of water. It was 4x8 sheets of wood holding back the most powerful river in the West. Miraculously, the plywood held. The inflow peaked and started to drop. The engineers were able to dial back the spillways before the tunnels completely disintegrated. When they finally inspected the tunnels, they were stunned. The water had carved a hole 32 feet deep into the solid rock. It was a cavern so big you could hide a house in it. That event changed everything. It proved that we are not in total control. The river is a monster that sleeps with one eye open. Since then, the spillways were redesigned with air slots to prevent cavitation. But the fear remains. Every time they plan a high-flow experiment like the one in '96 or the ones in the 2000s, the ghost of 1983 is watching. They have to balance the need to restore the ecosystem with the physical safety of the dam. But while the engineers worry about the concrete cracking, there is something else crumbling in the canyon. Something much older and much more fragile. The vanishing sandbars aren't just an ecological problem, they are a cultural tragedy. Because hidden along the riverbanks, buried in the sand, are the ghosts of a lost civilization. The water almost destroyed the future of the West, but now the lack of it is erasing the history of the past. History turning to dust. What most people don't realize is that the Grand Canyon isn't just a geological wonder, it is a graveyard and a home. For thousands of years, long before the first European laid eyes on the rim, people lived down here. We call them the ancestral Puebloans. They weren't just passing through, they built stone houses into the cliff faces. They farmed corn and beans on the river terraces. They left behind granaries, pottery, and mysterious rock art that we are still trying to decipher today. There are thousands of archaeological sites scattered along the river corridor. Some date back to the Archaic period, nearly 9,000 years ago. But here is the catch. These sites are in danger of vanishing forever, and it is all because of the dam. You might think, wait, how does a dam upstream destroy a stone ruin downstream? It comes back to the sand. In the natural cycle, the massive spring floods would deposit huge amounts of sand on the banks. Then the wind would pick up that dry sand and blow it inland, covering the ancient sites with a protective blanket of dunes. This sand blanket shielded the fragile stone walls and pottery from the rain and the harsh sun. It buried them, keeping them safe. But when the dam cut off the sediment supply, the sandbars shrank. There was less sand for the wind to pick up. The protective dunes began to deflate like a punctured tire. Now these ancient sites are being exposed. The rain washes away the mortar between the stones. The walls crumble. Tourists wandering off the path step on pottery shards that have been protected for a millennium. It is a slow-motion erasure of history. The tribes who claim ancestry to these people, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Navajo, the Paiute, they see this as a desecration. To them, the canyon isn't a park, it is a sacred space. The river is a living being, and the sites are the footprints of their ancestors. When the 1996 flood happened, one of the big questions was, will this help the archaeology? The hope was that the flood would rebuild the sandbars, the wind would blow the sand back over the ruins, and the sites would be reburied. And to some extent, it did happen. In some places, fresh dunes formed, covering up exposed foundations. It was a temporary victory. But in other places, the floodwaters actually cut into the banks, accelerating the erosion. It is a double-edged sword. The scientists found themselves in a moral dilemma. To save the fish in the river, they need floods. But those same floods can sometimes damage the very history they are trying to protect. The sheer amount of history down there is staggering. We are talking about entire roasting pits where they cooked agave. We are talking about petroglyphs that map the stars. And it is all incredibly fragile. Without the regular supply of sand, the Grand Canyon is becoming a skeleton. The flesh, the sand and soil is being stripped away, leaving only the bare bone of the bedrock. The National Park Service is in a race against time. They are excavating what they can, documenting what they can't save, but they can't save it all. Every time the wind blows through the canyon now, it carries a little less sand and a little more dust. And with that dust goes the story of the people who thrived here when the river was wild. But even if we solve the archaeology problem, and even if we fix the fish problem, there is a much bigger monster looming on the horizon. It is not about too much water anymore. It is about having none at all. The crazy part is that the very structure meant to save the West might actually be the thing that destroys it. We are approaching a tipping point where the science of floods won't matter because there won't be any water left to release. The ancient spirits are being exposed to the elements, but the living millions are facing a much drier, deadlier future. The end of the river. So here we are. We have flooded the canyon. We have studied the sand. We have tried to engineer our way out of a problem we created with our own hands. But the harsh reality is starting to set in. We aren't just fighting a losing battle, we are fighting a war we might have already lost decades ago. The Colorado River is in trouble. Serious trouble. We are living through what scientists are calling a mega drought. This isn't just a dry summer. This is the driest 20-year period in the American West in 1,200 years. Think about that. You have to go back to the collapse of ancient civilizations to find a time this dry. The snowpack in the Rockies, the white gold that feeds the river, is shrinking every winter. The evaporation in the reservoirs is increasing as the planet gets hotter. The ground itself is so thirsty that it drinks the melting snow before it can even reach the riverbed. Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the two massive savings accounts of water for the West, are running on empty. There is a terrifying term that experts use behind closed doors, a term that keeps hydrologists awake at night. Dead pool. This isn't a movie. This isn't science fiction. Dead pool is the specific point where the water level in the reservoir drops so low that gravity stops working for us. The water drops below the intake pipes. It can't flow through the dam's outlets. The river is effectively cut off. The water just sits there, stagnant, a massive, useless puddle trapped behind a concrete wall, unable to move downstream. If Lake Powell hits Deadpool, the Grand Canyon becomes a dry ditch. The river stops flowing, the rafting stops, the fish die. But worst of all, the electricity stops. And that is the elephant in the room that no one wants to look in the eye. Money. The Glen Canyon Dam isn't just a water tap, it is a massive humming beast of a power plant. It generates cheap, clean electricity for 5 million people across the West. We are talking about Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Nebraska. The grid relies on this power to stay stable. Every time they do a high-flow experiment, every time they release that flood to save the sandbars, they lose money. When water bypasses the turbines and shoots out of the jet tubes to simulate a flood, it doesn't generate a single watt of electricity. The 1996 flood experiment, that cost about $1.8 million in lost power revenue alone. That might not sound like much in the grand scheme of government spending, but do it over and over again, and the power companies start to get angry. They start lobbying. They start asking why we are flushing money down the river to save a few bugs and beaches. So now you have this brutal three-way standoff. In one corner you have the ecologists and the indigenous tribes. They say the river is a living entity. They say the fish have a right to exist, and the canyon needs to be restored to its natural rhythm. In the second corner you have the power companies and the megacities. They say we need cheap electricity and reliable water. We have millions of people in Phoenix and Las Vegas who need air conditioning and tap water. Don't waste a drop. And in the third corner, you have nature itself. And nature isn't negotiating. Nature is simply turning off the tap. The water releases are becoming harder to justify. How can you release a massive artificial flood to build beaches when the farmers in Arizona are being told to cut their water usage by 20%? How can you simulate a high flow when the reservoir is sitting at 25% capacity and dropping? It is a brutal calculation. But as the water drops, things are getting weird, really weird, and this is where the theories start to get wild. As Lake Powell recedes, it is revealing things that were never meant to be seen again. We are seeing ghost forests, trees that haven't seen the sun since the 1960s. We are seeing sunken boats. We are seeing the remains of old settlements. But some people believe we are about to see something much more controversial. There is a theory, a dark one, that the Glen Canyon Dam wasn't just built to store water. It was built to hide history. Before the dam was sealed in 1963, Glen Canyon was considered by many to be more beautiful than the Grand Canyon itself. It was a labyrinth of slot canyons, arches, and ancient ruins. For decades, rumors have circulated about what was really down there. We know about the ancestral Pueblo on ruins. We know about the petroglyphs, but there are whispers of something else. Go back to 1909. The Phoenix Gazette ran a front-page story claiming that an explorer named G.E. Kincaid found a massive underground citadel in the Grand Canyon. The article claimed he found mummies, artifacts that looked Egyptian or Asian, and statues that didn't fit any known Native American tribe. Historians call it a hoax. The Smithsonian denies it ever happened. But the conspiracy theorists ask a simple question. Why did we flood the most mysterious, unexplored canyons in North America? Was the dam a way to bury the evidence? Some theorists believe that as the water drops to historic lows, we might find the entrance to these lost caves. They believe the government is terrified of the water dropping not because of the electricity, but because of what will be exposed in the mud. Are there entrances to underground systems down there? Are there artifacts that rewrite American history? If the water hits Deadpool, we might just find out. And then there is the theory about the weather itself. Why is the drought so persistent? Why, despite all our technology, can we not make it rain? Well, some people point to the sky. We know that countries like China and the UAE are actively using cloud seeding technology to force rain to fall on their land. They shoot silver iodide into the clouds to make it snow or rain. But here is the dark side of weather modification. You can't create water. you can only steal it. If you force a cloud to dump its rain over the Pacific Northwest, that cloud is empty by the time it reaches the Colorado Rockies. There are wild theories circulating that we are in the middle of a weather war, that states or even corporations are manipulating the jet streams to secure water for their own regions, leaving the Colorado Basin to dry out. Is the mega drought natural, or is it a side effect of geoengineering gone wrong? And let's look at the sediment. The mud. We talked about how the dam traps sediment. 95% of the sand and silt is stuck behind that concrete wall. But it's not just sand. For 60 years, everything that has washed down the river has been trapped there. Agricultural runoff, pesticides, heavy metals from old mining operations upstream, Cold War-era waste. It has all been settling at the bottom of Lake Powell, buried under the water. Ecologists have a nightmare scenario that no one talks about on the news. If the lake dries up, that toxic sludge becomes exposed to the air. It dries out, it turns into dust, and then the wind picks it up. We could be looking at a toxic dust bowl. Clouds of arsenic-laced dust blowing into Utah and Arizona. It would be an environmental disaster that makes the lack of water look like a minor inconvenience. So, what do you think? Should we tear down the dam and let the river run wild, or is that a death sentence for the West? It is a choice between history and survival. Let me know in the comments. And if you want more truth, hit like and subscribe.